happens when a Portuguese word looks like English but actually means something quite different? Hi, I'm Jason, and this is Jason's Easy English, a podcast that helps you improve your English and learn about American culture with clear, understandable episodes in authentic, everyday language. Today, I'm going to share a funny story about my Brazilian friend Renata. One evening, we met some friends for drinks, and Renata accidentally created several confusing sentences in English. Why? Because she translated some Portuguese words directly into English. These are called false cognates or false friends. They're words that look very similar in two languages but actually have different meanings. So they're not true friends, they're false friends. They can be tricky, and sometimes they can create some very funny misunderstandings. A quick reminder, if you enjoy this content, please follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. All right, let's get started. First, a quick note. This story is fictional, but situations like this happen all the time when people are learning English. So imagine this. A few friends and I were meeting at a small bar after work. In the United States, it's very common for friends or coworkers to meet after work for a drink and some food. Bars often have happy hour, right? That's that time when drinks and snacks are cheaper. People relax, talk about their day, and spend time together. Renata had recently moved to the U.S., and her English was already very good. But sometimes Portuguese words would sneak into her thinking. At one point, our friend Mark asked her, "So Renata, what are you planning to do this weekend?" Renata smiled and said, "Oh, I pretend to visit my cousin in Chicago." Everyone paused. Mark looked confused. "You pretend to visit her?" Renata nodded confidently. "Yes, I pretend to go on Saturday morning." Now everyone was even more confused. In English, pretend means to act like something is true when it is not. So it means in Portuguese, fingir, or in Spanish, fingir. But Renata was actually thinking about the Portuguese word pretender, which means to intend or to plan to do something. Ter a intenção de pretender, nesse sentido. Or in Spanish, pretender, tener la intención de. So what she really wanted to say was, I plan to visit my cousin. Remember that Mark asked her, what do you plan to do? So she should have just answered, I plan to visit, or I'm going to visit. When I explained the difference, Renata laughed and said, "Oh no, that's a little dangerous." But the story didn't end there. A little later, someone asked Renata a simple question. "So, Renata, where do you live in Brazil?" Renata answered again confidently, "Actually, I live in Curitiba." Now, the sentence sounded just a little strange. In English, actually means in fact, or I really do this. Actually. So in Portuguese, it would be na verdade, or in Spanish, en realidad. But Renata was thinking about the Portuguese word atualmente. Atualmente means currently or right now. So when she said, "Actually, I live in Curitiba," it sounded like she was correcting someone, as if the other person had said the wrong city. But what she really meant was, I currently live in Curitiba. Then our friend Sarah started talking about her younger sister. She mentioned that her sister was 14 years old. Renata looked genuinely curious and asked, "So, does your sister attend college?" Sarah laughed. "No, she's only 14. In English, college usually means university or an institution of higher education, where students typically start around age 18. So, college means faculdade or universidad in Spanish. I recorded a separate podcast episode about this topic. But in Brazil, the word colégio usually refers to school for middle school or high school age students in the United States. So Renata didn't mean university. She was simply asking about school, perhaps high school. Later in the evening, Renata said something else that made everybody smile. She looked around the table and said, "I'm getting hungry. Should we order a lunch?" Now, it was almost 8 p.m., so Sarah laughed and said, "A lunch at night?" Renata quickly explained that in Brazil, people often say lanche, lanche, which means a snack or a small meal. It's spelled Lanche. But in English, lunch is specifically the midday meal, the meal between breakfast and dinner. So it would be almoço in Portuguese or almuerzo in Spanish. So when Renata asked if we should order a lunch, it sounded like she wanted a full midday meal, even though it was evening. So that's why everyone was confused. What she really meant was, should we order a snack or something light to eat? Then Renata started talking about her trips to Chicago. She said, "I like visiting Chicago because I save time staying with parents." With parents. Everyone at the table looked surprised and a little confused. Mark said, "Wait a minute. I thought your parents lived in Brazil." Renata looked confused also. "No, my parents live in Chicago." Now everyone was confused. And that's because in English, parents mean your mother and father. In Portuguese, os teus pais, or in Spanish, tus papás or tus padres. But Renata was thinking about the Portuguese word parente, which means any relative in the family, like a cousin, an aunt, or an uncle. So when she said that she stayed with parents, everyone imagined her mother and father living in Chicago. But she was referring to relatives there, her cousin's family. Renata quickly laughed and corrected herself. "Oh, sorry, I stay with my cousin." Now everything finally made sense. A little later, she added something else. "I visit Chicago eventually." Again, the sentence sounded a little strange to me and my friends. And that's because in English, eventually means after a certain amount of time or in the end. So in Portuguese, it could be something like com o tempo or finalmente, right? In Spanish, finalmente or con el pasar del tiempo has those two meanings in English. But in Portuguese, the word eventualmente, which was what Renata was thinking, often means occasionally or sometimes. So Renata didn't mean in the end. That would be confusing. She actually meant to say, "I occasionally visit Chicago," or "I visit Chicago from time to time," eventually in American English. Finally, Renata told us that she was excited about Halloween. As you know, Halloween is very popular in the United States. People decorate their houses, go to parties, and wear creative costumes. So speaking of costumes, Renata said, "I want to buy a vampire fantasy for Halloween." In English, fantasy usually means a story or imagination about magic or unreal worlds, something that's not real. Fantasía nesse sentido, right? So, fantasía en español, pero en ese sentido de algo imaginario. But the clothes that you wear for Halloween are called a costume. In Brazilian Portuguese, é uma fantasia. So what Renata really wanted to say was a vampire costume. By the end of the night, Renata was laughing about all of these small mistakes. And honestly, everyone thought the conversation was fun and learned a lot about American English and Portuguese. Moments like this are very normal when you're learning a new language. All right, I hope that was interesting. But before I let you go, let's review. Today we talked about several false friends, words that look similar in Portuguese and English, but actually have different meanings. We saw pretend, which means to act like something is real when it isn't, not the same as the Portuguese verb pretender, which means to intend. We also talked about actually, which in English means in fact, not currently. Then we saw college, which usually refers to university in English, while Portuguese colégio often means high school. We discussed lunch, the midday meal, which is different from the Portuguese lanche, a snack. We also looked at parent, which means your mother or father, not just any relative like the Portuguese term parente. Then we saw eventually, which means something happens after a certain period of time or finally, not occasionally. In Portuguese, it means occasionally, eventualmente. And finally, we talked about fantasy, which usually refers to imaginary stories, not the clothing you wear for Halloween. That's called a costume. False friends are very common between English and Portuguese, so misunderstandings like this are completely normal. Have you ever made a mistake because you used a false friend in English? If so, don't worry. Native speakers are usually patient and helpful when this happens. All right, that's all for today. I hope you understood most of the episode and learned something new. Be sure to follow and subscribe to my podcast, and please share Jason's Easy English with your friends who are also learning English. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you at the next episode.